Let me tell you about a guy who looked Hollywood straight in the eye and said, "No thank you, I'll do this myself." The year is 2003. Mel Gibson, yes, that Mel Gibson, the action star, the Braveheart guy, walks into meeting after meeting with major studios. He's carrying a script. He wants to make a film about the last 12 hours of Jesus Christ's life. And here's the kicker. He wants to film the whole thing in dead languages: Aramaic, Latin, Hebrew. No subtitles originally. No big-name cast, no car chases, no love story, no CGI spectacle to pull in the weekend crowd. Every single studio passed. Not a polite, "we'll think about it." A hard, firm, industry-wide no. The consensus in Hollywood was that this film would be a career-ending disaster. That nobody, not Christians, not casual moviegoers, not anyone, would sit in a dark theater and watch a man get brutalized for 2 hours in languages most people had never heard spoken aloud. So Gibson did something that most people in his position never do. He pulled out his own checkbook. He mortgaged his home. He used his personal savings. He essentially bet his entire financial future on a film that the most powerful entertainment industry on earth had collectively decided was a terrible idea. And then he went to Italy, gathered a cast of largely unknown actors, and made The Passion of the Christ exactly the way he believed it needed to be made. Raw, brutal, unfiltered, and completely unapologetic. You know how this ends. You probably already know the numbers. But let me say them anyway because they still hit different when you hear them together. $600 million worldwide. The highest-grossing R-rated film in American history. A record that stood for nearly 2 decades. A film that every major studio refused to touch became one of the most commercially successful religious films ever made, in any country, in any era, in any language. And here's what Gibson said after all of it. After the press tours, after the awards conversation, after the controversy and the acclaim and the staggering box office numbers. He looked at cameras and said essentially, that wasn't the whole story. The Passion ended at the tomb. Something came next. And that something, Gibson claimed, had never been properly told. Not in any film, not in any sermon most Western Christians had ever heard, not in any version of the Bible that most people in Europe or America had ever held in their hands. He said there were 2 scripts for a follow-up. One was conventional, safe, the kind of sequel that makes sense to a studio executive. And the other one? He described it on the Joe Rogan Experience. And I want you to picture him sitting there, this rugged Australian-American action legend, saying this with a completely straight face, as something like an acid trip, a journey through multiple realms, through dimensions that don't operate on human time, through hierarchies of angels and cosmic architecture that most modern Christians have never been taught existed. Most people heard that and figured he was being colorful, being cinematic, maybe a little eccentric. He wasn't being any of those things. He was describing, almost word for word, what a very specific, very ancient Bible has been saying for over 1,500 years. A Bible that most of the Western world has never read. A Bible that was almost destroyed. A Bible that survived only because of monks on a mountaintop who had no idea the rest of the world had thrown away what they were protecting. Here's where things get genuinely wild. Part 2. The Bible nobody told you about. Okay, imagine you're cleaning out your grandmother's attic and you find a chest. Inside the chest is a Bible. But when you open it, it's got 88 books in it. Your Bible at home has 66, maybe 73 if you're Catholic. But this one has 88. And the extra books aren't footnotes or appendices. They're full, complete, theologically loaded texts. Stories and visions and prophecies that read like nothing you've ever encountered in a Sunday sermon. That's not a hypothetical. That Bible exists. It's called the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible. And it belongs to one of the oldest Christian traditions on the planet. Most people in the Western world have never heard of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is honestly one of the stranger gaps in popular religious knowledge, because this institution is ancient. We're talking about a Christian community that has been continuously active since the 4th century, roughly the same era when Christianity was just becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. Ethiopia wasn't converted by missionaries. It wasn't a colonial project. The faith arrived and took root organically, spreading south and east from Jerusalem through trade routes and personal testimony, carried by people who had direct contact with the earliest generation of believers. It developed its own theology, its own liturgical language, Ge'ez, an ancient tongue that was serving as a vehicle for Christian scripture before Latin had even fully established itself in the same role. Its own traditions, its own artistic expression, its own understanding of who Jesus was and what the resurrection meant. And then, and this is the key moment, something happened geographically that accidentally preserved everything. In the 7th century, Islamic expansion reshaped the map of the Middle East and North Africa. Trade routes shifted, political boundaries realigned, and Ethiopia found itself, not by anyone's design, largely isolated from the rest of the Christian world. The councils and synods and doctrinal fights happening in Rome and Constantinople were taking place on the other side of a geographic and political barrier that Ethiopian Christianity simply didn't have to cross. What that means in practice is remarkable. When Rome was deciding what Christians were allowed to believe, when councils were voting on which books were sacred and which were dangerous, Ethiopia wasn't in the room. When copies of certain texts were being tracked down and burned, those texts were safely being copied in monastery scriptoriums in the Ethiopian highlands by monks who had no idea any of this was happening. The result is that the Ethiopian Bible contains books that the Western Church explicitly banned, suppressed, hunted down, and destroyed. Books that had been read by the earliest Christians, quoted by early church fathers, treated as genuine revelation, until one particular council in 363 AD decided that ordinary people weren't supposed to have access to them anymore. The three most significant of these banned texts are the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah. And what's inside them is going to reframe everything you thought you knew about the Jesus story. But before we get into what they actually say, we need to talk about the council that tried to erase them, because the story of why these books were banned is almost as shocking as the books themselves. Part 3. The day they voted Jesus out. Picture a room full of powerful men in robes. The year is 363 AD. The location is a city called Laodicea, in what is now modern Turkey. These are bishops, senior leaders of the early Christian church, and they are doing something that most ordinary Christians sitting in pews today have never been told happened. They are voting on what God is allowed to say. Now, they wouldn't have framed it that way. They would have called it canonization, the responsible organization of sacred texts, protecting the faithful from confusion, all of which sounds reasonable until you start looking at which books got cut and why. The Book of Enoch is the big one. Let's start there because its story alone should make your jaw drop. This is not some fringe manuscript scribbled by a random mystic in a cave somewhere. Fragments of the Book of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, which tells us it was being read and preserved by serious, devout Jewish communities in the centuries immediately surrounding the birth of Christianity. Early church fathers didn't just know about it, they quoted it. They referenced it as authoritative. They treated it the way modern Christians treat Paul's letters. And here's the one that should really stop you in your tracks. The New Testament book of Jude, a book that did make it through the canonical filter, a book that sits in your Bible right now, directly quotes the Book of Enoch and cites it as genuine prophecy, not as folklore, not as poetry, as actual authoritative God-breathed revelation. So we have a text that was among the Dead Sea Scrolls, that was quoted by early church fathers, that is literally cited inside the New Testament itself. And in 363 AD, a group of bishops voted it off the island, declared it off limits, had copies tracked down and destroyed. And for the next 17 centuries, the vast majority of Western Christianity never encountered what it said. Now here's the question you should be asking. Why? What is in this book that was so threatening to a centralized religious institution that they needed it gone? Because it's confusing doesn't cut it as an answer when the text was already being quoted inside Scripture. It might mislead people, doesn't hold up when the earliest church fathers were treating it as revelation. The real answer, when you actually read these texts, is uncomfortable. Because the Jesus described in the Book of Enoch, the Ascension of Isaiah, and the other preserved Ethiopian texts offers something that no religious institution can control, package, or charge admission for. Direct access. Personal, unmediated, no middleman required access to the divine. These texts record a Christ who tells people, in plain, unflinching language, that the kingdom of God is not a place you apply to get into. It's not a status you earn through the right sacraments performed by the right clergy. It's something already inside you, already present, already yours. A divine spark that exists in every human being, not because they earned it, but because of what they fundamentally are. Now sit with that for a second, and ask yourself how an institution built on the authority of priests, the necessity of sacraments, the power of indulgences, and the absolute requirement of institutional mediation between a person and God, how does that institution survive if these are the words reaching ordinary people every Sunday morning? It doesn't. It can't. The business model collapses entirely. So the words were removed. The cosmic, direct, electrifyingly personal Christ of these ancient texts was quietly replaced with something more manageable. A beautiful figure. A gentle figure. A figure that fit inside a frame on a church wall and required a designated authority figure to explain what he meant and what you needed to do to get close to him. The monks in Ethiopia never received that replacement. They kept copying the original, and what they preserved is something that, once you actually read it, you cannot unsee. Part 4. The Jesus Nobody Painted. All right, here's where I need you to do something. Close your eyes for a second. Well, finish reading this paragraph first, and picture Jesus. Whatever image comes to mind. Chances are it looks something like this: pale skin, flowing brown hair, kind eyes, a serene expression, maybe a lamb somewhere nearby. Soft, gentle, approachable. The kind of figure you'd feel comfortable having a quiet conversation with over tea. That image has a specific origin. It came from European Renaissance painters working 1,000 years after the original texts were written, illustrating a canon that had already been filtered, edited, and stripped of its most cosmically overwhelming content. It is, in other words, a portrait of a portrait of a portrait, each generation softening the edges a little more, domesticating the figure a little further, until what remained bore almost no resemblance to what the earliest sources actually described. So let me tell you what the earliest sources actually described. The Book of Enoch introduces a figure called the Son of Man, the Chosen One, the Righteous Judge. And the language used to describe him doesn't belong in the same category as anything hanging in a Western church. His face contains a grace so overwhelming that human language physically cannot contain it. Enoch essentially apologizes mid-description for the inadequacy of words. He is seated at the center of a heavenly courtroom, surrounded by rivers of fire. Angels, beings of incomprehensible power who have existed since before the first atom of the universe came into being, fall to their knees in his presence. His authority doesn't extend over one nation, or one era, or one dimension of reality. It extends over everything, every realm, every age, every corner of existence that has ever been or will ever be. Now here's the moment that should genuinely give you chills. Open the Book of Revelation, the one apocalyptic text that did survive the canonical purge. Go to chapter 1, verses 14 through 16. The description of Christ that John gives there: hair white as wool, eyes like blazing fire, feet like molten bronze glowing in a furnace, voice like the sound of rushing floodwaters, a face that blazes with light so intense it is described as the full force of the sun at its absolute peak. Read Enoch. Read Revelation. The descriptions aren't similar the way two paintings of the same mountain might be similar. They are the same description, the same imagery, the same overwhelming, physics-defying, language-breaking portrait of a being so far beyond human scale that the writers can only reach for fire and light and the collapse of normal perception to get anywhere close. Biblical scholars who specialize in ancient Jewish and early Christian texts have confirmed this isn't coincidence. The author of Revelation was drawing directly from the Enochic tradition. They were working from the same source material, describing the same vision, using the same symbolic language, because it was the established vocabulary for talking about this specific figure. Which means that the Jesus of Revelation, the terrifying, blazing, cosmically sovereign being that Western Christians mostly skip over because frankly it doesn't fit the gentle shepherd narrative, is the same Jesus that the Book of Enoch described in detail. The same Jesus that Ethiopian monks have been reading about for 15 centuries. The same Jesus that the Council of Laodicea decided ordinary people weren't ready for. And then there's the Ascension of Isaiah, which takes all of this even further into territory that sounds less like theology and more like the most ambitious science fiction ever written. except it predates science fiction by about 1800 years. The Ascension of Isaiah describes creation as a structure of 7 distinct heavens, each one more overwhelming than the last. The first heaven handles the affairs of earth. The second governs the movements of stars across the cosmos. By the third, you're in paradise, the tree of life, gates made of living fire, floors that appear to be constructed from compressed starlight. By the sixth heaven, the text essentially says that a human consciousness simply cannot process what exists there. The seventh heaven, the supreme realm, the innermost chamber of existence, is described as a place where no created being can survive in its full, unshielded presence. And it is from the seventh heaven that Christ descends. But here's the detail that I want you to sit with, because it is genuinely one of the most extraordinary things written in any ancient religious text. At every level of that descent, at each of the 7 heavens on the way down to earth, Christ deliberately veils himself. He dims his own radiance. He modulates his presence to match the frequency of whatever beings exist at that level, so that angels perceive him as an angel, celestial beings perceive him as one of their own kind. Not because he's hiding in shame, not because he's being deceptive, but because if he arrived at his full, unfiltered magnitude at any point in that descent, the text says existence itself could not survive the encounter. The very fabric of reality at that level would simply not be able to hold what he actually is. He arrives in Bethlehem as a human infant. Every realm of creation watched the incarnation happen, and almost none of them knew what they were looking at. Only the Father and the Spirit understood what had entered that manger. The most powerful event in the history of existence looked, from the outside, like a baby being born in a barn. Now tell me that doesn't reframe the nativity scene sitting on your mantelpiece. This is the portrait that Ethiopian Christians have been living with for 1,500 years. This is what gets read in their churches, painted on their walls, sung in their liturgies. Not a gentle figure to be managed and domesticated, but Jesus Christos, Lord of the universe, whose arrival on earth was a cosmic event of such staggering magnitude that reality itself had to be carefully shielded from the full force of his presence, just so it didn't shatter on the way down. And Mel Gibson found these texts and decided to put them on the biggest screens in the world. Which brings us to what is actually happening right now, in Rome, as you read this. Part 5. What's being built in Rome. Cinecittà Studios sits on the southern edge of Rome. It's one of the most storied film production facilities in the world. Federico Fellini made his greatest films there. Ben-Hur was shot there. It's been the backdrop for some of the most ambitious cinematic visions of the last century. And right now, on its stages and backlots, something is being built that the film industry is talking about in hushed, slightly disbelieving tones. The resurrection of the Christ is not a rumor. It is not a development deal. It is not a pitch deck being shopped around. It is actively filming. $100 million budget. Lionsgate handling global distribution. Part 1 scheduled for release on Good Friday 2027. Part 2, and this detail matters, on Ascension Day, exactly 40 days later. Even the release schedule is a theological argument. Gibson isn't just making a film. He's structuring the entire commercial and calendrical experience of the project around the sacred timeline it's depicting. That's not a marketing decision. That's a directorial statement about what this story actually is. The scripts are classified. That word, classified, gets used in Washington for national security documents and in Hollywood almost never. But at the American film market, where international distribution deals are made, buyers were told they could not read the scripts before committing. In an industry where studios won't greenlight a project without reading every draft 3 times, where international distributors demand screeners and pitch decks and detailed breakdowns before writing a check, Gibson asked them to sign deals based purely on his name, his track record, and the vague promise of something unprecedented. Most of them did. What Gibson has confirmed publicly, in fragments across various interviews, is enough to tell you exactly where he found his source material. The film begins before Bethlehem. It opens with the fall of the angels, a sequence that has no equivalent in any Western biblical film ever made, because it draws from a tradition that Western biblical films have never had access to. It will move through realms that operate on different rules than physical reality. And the resurrection itself, Gibson has said explicitly, cannot be told as a single linear event because it did not occur in a single linear dimension. That last sentence. Sit with that last sentence. A filmmaker is telling you that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was a multidimensional event that occurred simultaneously across different layers of reality, and that telling the story honestly requires showing all of those layers. That is not a filmmaker being eccentric or pretentious. That is someone who read the Ascension of Isaiah, with its 7 heavens, its cosmic architecture, its portrait of a being whose death and return to life would have reverberated through every realm he passed through on the way down, and understood that the Western Church's single location, single moment, stone-rolled-away version of the resurrection story was always missing about 90% of what actually happened. The thing that makes this particularly extraordinary is the trajectory that led here. Gibson has been talking about a sequel to The Passion for over 2 decades. 2 scripts, 1 conventional. 1, and here's that phrase again, like an acid trip through multiple realms. For years, people assumed the acid trip version was the fantasy, the dream project that would never actually get made. The conventional version was the real one, the safe bet. He's making the acid trip version. And based on what we now know about the Ethiopian biblical tradition, based on the Ascension of Isaiah and the Book of Enoch and the cosmic Christ that Ethiopian monks have been preserving while Western Christianity built increasingly comfortable portraits of a much smaller figure, the acid trip version isn't the eccentric one. It's the accurate one. It's the one that matches the oldest sources. It's the one the earliest Christians would have recognized. The gentle, framed, Renaissance painting Jesus is the departure from the original. Gibson is trying to return to the source. Part 6. The Monks Who Saved Everything. I want to take a moment away from Hollywood and $100 million budgets and talk about the people who actually made all of this possible. Because without them, none of it exists. The Ethiopian monks who kept copying these manuscripts through everything, through wars and invasions and centuries of isolation from the rest of the Christian world, deserve to be at the center of this story. Imagine the commitment involved. You're a monk in a monastery carved into a cliff face in the Ethiopian highlands. You have no contact with Rome. You have no idea what councils are convening, what texts are being burned, what portraits of Jesus are being officially sanctioned by the most powerful religious institution in the Western world. You just have your manuscripts, your community, your daily rhythm of prayer and work and copying. And every day, you sit down and you copy. Word by word, page by page, book by book. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah. The texts that describe a Christ of blazing, cosmic, uncontainable authority who told human beings they carry divinity inside them and need no institution's permission to access it. You copy it because you believe it's true, not because anyone's watching, not because it will become famous, not because a Hollywood director will one day spend $100 million adapting it. You copy it because it's sacred, and your job is to preserve what is sacred. And that's the beginning and end of the calculation. Generation after generation, for 1,500 years, through the Council of Laodicea burning copies in the West, through the Islamic expansion that isolated Ethiopia from the rest of the Christian world, through conflicts and famines and political upheavals that threatened the monasteries themselves, the monks kept going, kept copying, kept preserving a portrait of Jesus that the Roman institution had decided was too powerful, too direct, too democratizing to be public knowledge. Walk into an Ethiopian Orthodox church today, and the difference from a Western church is immediate and visceral. The figure on the wall is not the pale, soft-eyed shepherd of European religious painting. It's Jesus Christos, dark-skinned, deep-eyed, surrounded by gold that doesn't represent wealth or luxury, but the actual fire of divine presence. Fully human and fully cosmic at the same time. Not softened for accessibility. Not reframed for institutional comfort. The same figure Enoch described. The same being Isaiah mapped across the architecture of 7 heavens. In Ethiopian theology, the miracles of Jesus aren't sweet stories about a kind teacher helping people in need. They are acts of cosmic restoration. When Jesus commands a storm to be still, creation is recognizing its author and obeying, the way a piece of music resolves when the composer touches the right note. When he heals the sick, the original design of existence is being repaired, the way a master craftsman restores something that was broken. When he raises the dead, he isn't bending the rules of reality. He is asserting that life is more fundamental than death, that it always was, and that death's apparent permanence was the illusion, not the other way around. That's a completely different theological framework from what most Western Christians grew up with, and it comes directly from the texts that the monks preserved, the texts that were supposed to be gone, the texts that survived because of people who sat in stone rooms on mountain cliffs and copied every word they believed God had spoken, with no audience and no expectation of recognition, for a millennium and a half. Modern scholars who have begun seriously examining the Ethiopian manuscript tradition, and there are frustratingly few of them, because Western academia spent centuries not taking this tradition seriously, are quietly arriving at a conclusion that is reshaping the field of early Christian history. Some of the most sophisticated theological scholarship of the first millennium may not have been happening in Rome or Constantinople. It may have been happening in Africa, in monasteries that Western scholars never visited, in a sacred language that Western seminaries never taught, preserving texts that Western councils had decided needed to be erased. There are manuscripts in the Ethiopian highlands that have never been fully translated into any modern language, texts that scholars have barely begun to examine, traditions that exist nowhere in Western academic literature. The monks preserved more than has yet been read, which raises the question that's been sitting quietly underneath this entire story, and which I think deserves to be asked out loud. Part 7. What comes after the reveal? Here's the thing about secrets that get kept for 1,500 years. When they finally come out, they don't just add a footnote to what you already believed. They restructure the whole picture. They make you realize that what you thought was the complete image was actually a corner of something much, much larger. The Book of Enoch alone, one text, one of the books that Ethiopian monks preserved while Western Christianity burned copies, is already reshaping how serious scholars think about the origins of Christian theology. Its portrait of the Son of Man is being recognized as the direct source for the imagery and revelation that Western readers have been scratching their heads over for centuries. The blazing eyes, the white hair, the voice like rushing water, the unbearable light. None of it was mysterious metaphor invented by John on the island of Patmos. It was established Enochic vocabulary for describing a specific being, a vocabulary that the earliest Christians all understood and that got buried along with the text itself. When Gibson's film arrives in 2027, assuming it delivers what he's been describing, and his track record suggests we should take him at his word, it will be the first time that the vast majority of the world encounters the cosmic Christ of the Ethiopian tradition on any kind of mainstream platform. The being of absolute, reality-bending, dimension-spanning authority who chose to arrive as a baby in a feeding trough, whose death wasn't just an execution in a Roman province, but a rupture in the fabric of existence itself, whose resurrection wasn't a single moment in a garden outside Jerusalem, but a cosmic explosion of reclaimed authority, reverberating simultaneously through every layer of reality that the Ascension of Isaiah mapped. That portrait, once you actually see it, once it lands, doesn't leave room for the framed, gentle, manageable version to fully occupy the same mental space anymore. Not because the gentle version is wrong exactly, but because it's so radically incomplete. It's like having a photograph of someone's eye and thinking you know what they look like. The moment you see the full image, the partial one can never feel complete again. And here's what makes this moment genuinely unprecedented. It's not just Gibson's film. It's the combination of what the film will do culturally with what's happening simultaneously in academic circles, in online communities where people are actually reading the Book of Enoch for the first time, in Ethiopian churches that are becoming more visible globally, in a broader conversation about what was actually contained in the earliest layer of Christian tradition before the institutional editing began. People are waking up to the fact that the Bible they hold is not the Bible the earliest Christians read, that the canon they were raised on was assembled by committees with institutional interests, not handed down intact from the original sources, that there is a tradition, living, continuous, unbroken, that preserved what the committees removed, and that tradition is Ethiopian, and it has been sitting in those highland monasteries all along, patient as the mountains themselves, waiting for the moment when the world was ready to ask the right questions. The monks never expected this. They have no strategy. No plan for maximum exposure. No awareness that they were sitting on something the rest of the world needed. They just believed the texts were true, believed that preserving truth was the work they'd been given, and got up every morning and did that work. For 1,500 years. And somewhere in the Tigray highlands right now, there are manuscripts that no Western scholar has yet opened. Texts in Ge'ez that have never been rendered into any modern language. Traditions that were preserved alongside Enoch and Isaiah and Jubilees, that contain things we don't even know we're missing yet. If a single text, the Book of Enoch, banned in 363 AD, preserved by Ethiopian monks, finally making its way into mainstream consciousness, is enough to fundamentally reframe our understanding of who Jesus was and what the resurrection means, what happens when the unopened manuscripts finally see the light? What else did they preserve? What else was buried? And perhaps the most important question of all, what does it mean for the billions of people walking around right now carrying an image of Jesus that was built from the edited version, the version that survived the purge, the version that fit inside the institutional frame, when they finally get to see the original? Mel Gibson is betting $100 million that they're ready. The monks on the mountaintop have been betting their entire lives on the same thing. I think they might both be right. The Resurrection of the Christ, Part 1, releases Good Friday 2027. Part 2, Ascension Day, 40 days later. The Ethiopian Orthodox Bible has been sitting in plain sight for 15 centuries. The Book of Enoch is freely available online. The Ascension of Isaiah has been translated into English. The monks did their part. The rest now is up to us.